Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is an extra special and a second edition from the wonderful mind of Michael G. Lockhart. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Flight, Fight, or Freeze. Let's get straight into that. There are three basic options for survival: flight, fight, or freeze. Each has an appropriate use and circumstances to be employed. Any animal may freeze momentarily to assess a threat. Often that freeze ends in death, sometimes for them, sometimes for their companions. They may go to ground, hide, and then freeze in the hopes that a predator or predators won't be able to track them to their lairs. They may take flight, run, fly, or swim at their fastest. Sometimes they are quick enough, and sometimes the predators and scavengers find full bellies. When all else fails, when there are no other options, there is a fight to the finish. Here he comes, puffed Lloyd into the frigid mountain air. Lean and mean, the fighting machine, Top Vic, he called to his approaching friend. His two companions echoed the sentiments, and they all shook hands, exchanged hugs, and gripped shoulders. Then the four grown men locked arms over one another's shoulders and faced into a tight circle with their heads down. On an unseen cue, they started breathing heavily and panting, and then, as one, they raised their heads towards the heavens and let forth a ferocious howl, followed by individual yips and growls and howls. The cacophony ended in grins and easy laughter. The quartet had been friends since early childhood, and as adults each year that they could all be together, they met to have an adventure. They each took turns to host the events, and each one had bonded them further. They were already like brothers, even though each had a distinctive personality that to an outsider would make them appear incompatible as friends, and each had taken a very different pathway into adulthood. Yet they were not just friends, they were brothers, not by blood, but by choice. They were the Four-Pack. The name had started when Daniel's mum had bought them a 4-pack of iced coffees when they were all around age 11. They begged to try it, and she enjoyed the faces they displayed when they, all together, as always, took large gulps of the bitter drink. Once all of their parents and natural siblings heard the tale, they were dubbed the 4-Pack of Bitter Faces. They adopted the name, and during high school they played for the Timberwolves football team, or supported the team in some way. And so the handle morphed into just the Pack. Victor and Lloyd played defence and offensive respectively. Daniel worked the sound booth at the stadium and came up with light shows and other pre-game and half-time entertainment. And Matt played the sax in a marching band. During baseball season, Daniel was the starting pitcher. Outside of school, they'd all taken martial art classes together. That's where Matt outshined them all. Always a bit thin and gawky, he grew into a lean man with incredible manual dexterity. He was quick and would end up putting the others in a hold before they could strike him into submission. It paid off when he later became a neurosurgeon. He needed the strong and agile fingers, and his patients appreciated them. He had the hardest time getting away since he and his wife had a young daughter, and the missus was a doctor as well at the medical centre in Houston. Daniel was a techno geek when he wasn't throwing curveballs and trying to out-strategize the other teams. He knew and followed every baseball, even as an adult. His card collection was impressive, and although he had a tough time paying for school, he refused to sell any of them. It didn't matter, he found his life's calling before he graduated and made a fortune in both hardware and software for drones. He had married young, had a boy and a girl, and then divorced. He found a better wife the second time, less glamorous but self-sufficient. They had 2 boys together and a very nice life in Georgetown, just north of Austin, with their own 4-pack of kids. Victor joined the army even before they graduated high school. It's all he's ever wanted to do. He'd signed up for all the cool kid schools and was certified to kill the enemy on any terrain. And he had, though he rarely spoke of those moments. This gathering was an excuse for the others to get together to celebrate the newly promoted First Sergeant Vic. Victor and his wife had their own 4-pack of kids, 3 girls and a boy. His wife was a school teacher, and so they were mobile when they had to be, but he'd early on made Fort Benning his home base, and they planned to retire in northern Georgia in several years. Lloyd, he had joined the army with Vic, but he only wanted college money. He did his 3 years and moved on to college to study ecology and the great outdoors. As soon as he was eligible, he applied to be a park ranger for the national parks. He and his girlfriend had gotten engaged in college, but she died from an allergic reaction their senior year. He had never had a serious relationship since. He'd always loved the outdoors, but it seemed to his family, especially his younger sister and brother, who knew him best, that he had fled to the wilderness in grief, the way some people flee into religious orders after personal tragedies. He had fallen for the big sky country and worked for the parks in Wyoming. So, you have everything you need, Tub Vic? He glanced towards the rented SUV that Vic had picked up in Cheyenne. Roger that, Vic replied enthusiastically. He nodded towards the ranger station where they decided to meet. This our digs for tonight, or do you have something more private? Private. He grinned viciously at Lloyd, who in fact made it to Spec 4 when he'd completed his term of service. Vic had made rank quickly during combat tours and would likely complete his career as a command sergeant major, and he'd like to rub it in for fun. Lloyd rolled his eyes and thought, he won't let it go now. He will never let me live it down if he makes smudge. As command sergeant major. Besides, I did my fair share, and my partner gave the last full measure. You know I have more pull these days, right? I have a cabin off one of the trailheads. Not the trail we are taking, but close enough. It connects a little way uphill. If everyone will please mount this vehicle, we will be on our way. David and Matt had met up and shared a flight, and then a rental from Cheyenne. Before he hopped back into his SUV, Victor squeezed Lloyd's shoulder. I know you did your part, brother, and your canine gave it all to save the lives of his 2-legged companions, with pitiful sniffers. Rebel was a prince among dogs. Lloyd just nodded his thanks and teared up a little. His scout dog had uncovered an ambush and saved many human lives, but he had taken a fatal hit. Lloyd had made those Taliban terror-tards pay in blood, but nothing he did helped his poor pup that bled out on the forlorn mountain trail in Afghanistan. He hated that place and anything to do with foolish, violently minded ideologies. He clambered into his official vehicle and led the way to his cabin just a few miles up the way. He'd laid in supplies of food, booze and firewood, as was expected of each host. He set aside gear for Daniel and Matt. They'd each have some, but he doubted they would have everything necessary to hike the Tetons on the back trail he'd found. Vic may have. He told him about the terrain in general and what environment to expect in early spring. The man was fit and Lloyd knew he could take care of business. Lloyd truly hoped he'd planned something special, and Vic and the others loved the challenge. He thought about the gear to avoid, thinking about his personal losses. They spent the rest of the afternoon and evening getting caught up and passing around a few of their favourite drinks, except for Lloyd, who had been on a call with the park office. Everyone agreed to leave his cell phone at the cabin. They would be out of range to use them anyway, and every ounce they carried would be more to heft as they hiked. So, Lloydo, what's the plan? The whitewater rafting trip last time was cool, and sometimes cold, Daniel cracked. He was still a nerd, even though he'd gotten himself in better shape, at the behest of the new wife and the expensive gym and personal trainer he could easily afford. Well, Dano, as I told you, be ready for a hike. It's not a crazy long one, and we are going someplace in particular. Looks like we have an entire week this time, counting today. Your return trips and the cushion/rest day that you will all need. That means 4 days of actual fun. 1 day in, 2 days on the site, and 1 day out. I've provided a plan to the office because we're going where only I have been before. Daniel and Matt made an effort to produce the theme from the original Star Trek series, but it quickly fell apart into dawkish laughter. Lloyd pretended to give them a sour look, but continued. "We'll start right here, on the trail by my cabin. We'll go a few miles in and up, and there's a game trail that cuts northwest. It crosses some rough country, but at the end, there is this spot." At that point, his eyes grew distant for a moment. "It's like nothing you've ever seen. I won't try to describe it. Just trust me. It's worth the climbing, and the scrambling we'll have to do." Vic spoke up. "So it's not a regular tourist trail?" Lloyd shook his head, as much to clear his moment of reverie as to answer the question. "No, it's less than 10 minutes flying distance from the head of the game trail, and the terrain makes it much longer on foot. No other way to do it. A hidden gem in an already breathtaking landscape." He looked up and around the room. "Just know that it is far more of a dangerous endeavour than jumping out of a perfectly good aircraft, as we did on Vic's last turn." That led to some laughter and ribbing, and Daniel and Matt had not been thrilled, especially Matt, who had feared heights since a broken tree limb resulted in a pair of broken arms when he was 7. It had led to his fascination with medicine, but had affected him up until his brothers, indeed, if not in blood coaxed, he claimed, shoved him to jump. It had been the most exhilarating moment of his life, and he had thanked Victor to the point that a big scared man had blushed. Matt had repaid him on the next event. Victor had never cared for large animals. He wasn't phobic, he just didn't like the thought of riding a large living creature that he couldn't completely control. He liked to be in control. He managed by the end of the short week at a dude's ranch to ride like a natural, and his new view on horses helped him immensely during his later Afghan adventures. Daniel, he was into diving. I had dragged Lloyd out to the sea with the rest of the gang. Lloyd had an unreasonable fear of deep water, not of drowning but of the creatures in its depths. One of his friends in the college who believed in reincarnation told him he must have died at sea in an earlier life. Perhaps he'd been a whaler. A little too odd for him, though he possessed a spiritual nature. Past lives were a step too far. In the end, he dove just a little deeper than the rest of the group to touch the shipwreck that had been the object of the underwater quest, and later in the trip actually petted a shark. He'd never had a love for the sea, but he no longer feared its depths. They all loved challenging one another and helping one another to overcome fears. It was the greatest strength of their enduring friendship. This trip would address Daniel's uncomfortable feelings about being outdoors in the wilderness. He'd been briefly lost for several days during a family trip when he was 5. He came back with no real memories of where he'd been, but he had become a dedicated urbanite. This hike with people he trusted above all would help him overcome his fears. Lloyd ensured that each member of the party was packed and ready before they went to sleep. He checked each pack and had Vic do the same for him. He gave each a check-off list and they checked their own gear a second time. In addition to the other gear, Lloyd issued small locator beacons to each member of the party. He would carry a radio and backup battery. He indicated a case that sat beside the sofa. "I have my own, but each of you will need a pistol. We can all shoot, and if we run across any dangerous wildlife or Jason Voorhees types, we'll be able to handle it. 2 of these are borrowed, so please be careful with them. I have a couple of rifles, but with 4 large caliber handguns, we should be able to take down any natural predators. No need to haul the extra weight." Matt looked thoughtful for a moment and then asked deadpan, "What about unnatural predators?" He managed a nervous look for a few seconds, then waggled his eyebrows and burst out laughing. He loved science fiction, but had never had much use for the supernatural. Neither had Victor, who laughed with him. Lloyd and Daniel looked at one another and shrugged. They'd always been both sci-fi and horror fans. They took turns in the bathroom and turned in to rest and prepare for the big day tomorrow. "Here's the branch where we start the special trail." Lloyd indicated a space between a pair of trees that looked no different to half the party than any of the other trees. Even Victor had to stop and study the area to gain his bearings. Daniel looked around nervously. "Lloyd, this looks like the same as every other tree we've passed. How do you remember for sure?" Lloyd pointed up the trail about 40 yards and to a small display that was placed beside the trail to describe some of the local flora and fauna. That display marker is number 1708. He then pointed to one of the trees that marked the gateway onto the faint trail. See the huge knot in that pine? It's just before the lowest branches. It really stands out from any other tree in the area. Now look at the ground. There is hardly any straw on the ground in that direction, and where it's completely bare, there's a rut that goes in the general direction we need. It's not straight. It follows the path of least resistance. So that's the track we'll follow, at least for a while. I'll point out some other landmarks as we go, so you can get a feel for how to navigate. We'll make you a woodsman yet, Dano. By the time we get back, it'll be Dan L., as in Daniel L. Boone. He said the last with a light clap on Daniel's shoulder. Yeah? Well, you are the one who looks like a lumberjack guy, on the paper towels, Daniel replied, sounding more himself. Matt chimed in. I don't think it's a man on the package anymore. Well, Dan L. said, guy, not man, and these days, that could mean anybody. Victor added while wearing an exaggerated look of innocence. The rest of the group knew that early in his career he had to attend sensitivity training because of the comments he made. The rest laughed as Lloyd rolled his eyes, straightened his red plaid shirt with an exaggerated air of dignity, and then began walking forward on his game trail. He looked back and grinned at the lot of them to show he wasn't actually offended. In fact, his mood was ebullient. He was in his element. They trekked onward into the wilderness until the track took a sharper than usual turn as the terrain began to sharply rise. Lloyd stopped them for a rest break and again pointed out identifying features in the landscape. We'll be going up for a while, but there's a nice saddle between the high points. That's the easiest and fastest route. It's also easy to discern. After that, we cross some wild water, and then a slow climb for a while. Don't worry though, the final portion is nice and downward on a drop-off, and then a sharp downward slope. No more climbing until we go back to civilization. As they climbed, they started to encounter snow on the ground. It got deeper, and they roped together for the last ascent onto and over the saddle. When they got back to the lower ground, there was indeed a rushing rill of water, much of it still sheathed in ice. It wasn't wide, but the water was relatively deep and forceful, and would sweep down anyone who was careless about crossing. Lloyd went first. He crossed onto the rocks that were slippery with ice, and at the middle of the stream he had to leap from one ice-covered outcrop to another on the other side. He did it like a mountain goat, to the envy of the others. He had a safety line attached in case he fell, so that he wouldn't be swept downstream. And when he made it to the other side, he tied off the rope and tossed the other end to Victor, who tied up his end in turn. Victor went next. He had a short line tied around the safety line. Victor made it like a man rather than a mountain goat, with a near spill when he made his leap. Matt made the crossing efficiently. Daniel made it to the leap in a display of confidence that impressed the others. And then he slipped, and the safety line went instantly taut at his feet and legs and sunk into the water. His personal line was still around him, and he managed to grab a hold of the main safety line. Victor and Matt started to surge forward to help him, but Lloyd held them back. He hissed over his shoulder, "No, let him do it. He needs to make it on his own, to boost his morale. He's already slipped. He needs an individual victory." Victor nodded, and Matt simply relaxed a little to show that he understood. Daniel used his grip onto the safety line to swing his feet onto the rock on the far side of the leap. He pulled and slid his gloved hands until he was able to stand upright. He puffed a few breaths to regain his normal breathing pattern, and then completed the crossing. The group halted while Daniel switched out his pants and socks. They all congratulated their shivering brother and gathered around him for another group howl. As the last of their howls faded and the echoes among the surrounding highlands, they heard a chilling sound as the howls were answered, and from none too far away. Everyone looked first to the north in the direction of the haunting sound, and then towards Lloyd. He remained silent for a moment, and then, apparently, we have rudely awakened another wolf pack. We maybe sounded like a challenge. Probably best to get moving and get out of this valley and into the Vale. They crossed the high point and started down the far side. Matt spoke up. "I thought you said this next part was steep, Lloyd." Lloyd nodded and came to a stop. The others gathered around him and he pointed forward. "You notice how the horizon seems to stretch just ahead?" Each of the others nodded and he continued. "That's where it gets steep. Time to walk carefully. We may get closer than we think with the snow and ice cover. Wouldn't want to take a step over the edge. It's not exactly a cliff, but we'll need to use ropes and anchor points to descend safely." They made the descent without serious mishap, then covered the last small rise and looked out over a new horizon. None of them spoke or made any silly comments. They just breathed the thin, cold air deeply and stood mesmerized at the sight before them. The ridge that crossed turned into mountains that turned into northwest. There was more high ground on the other side of the exquisite valley, at the centre of which stood a clear mountain lake. The water was almost unnaturally still and calm. Trees grew right up to the edges in most parts. On an arm of the northwestern mountains protruded to create a cliff to which a tunnel of ice clung, and through which a small river flowed. Where the waterfall struck the lake, the water churned, but the ripples, the impacts emitted, were quickly absorbed into the surface of the water. The afternoon light was still bright as the sun dipped mostly behind the mountains in the distance. Golden rays reached upward into the heavens. Lloyd started to speak, at first quietly, but the volume and strength in his voice rose as he recited. "The world was young, the mountains green, no stain yet on the moon was seen. No words were laid on stream or stone, when Durin woke and walked alone. He named the nameless hills and dells, he drank from yet untasted wells. He stooped and looked in Mirromere, and saw a crown of stars appear, as gems upon a silver thread, above the shadow of his head." The others listened enchanted. Surprisingly, it was Victor who spoke first. "That's from J.R.R. Tolkien, right? One of the parts about dwarves?" Lloyd looked up and smiled. Yes, the man had a poetic soul and knew his old world's myths and legends. When I first laid eyes on this place, I knew it was Mirromere, even though it was so distant from the lands of the sagas, the inspiration for much of Tolkien's world-building. The rest of the men stared at Lloyd for a moment. They were all at top of their trades and often forgot that he was at top of his own field, at least locally. It was easy to forget his spiritual aspects since he had been such an emotional wreck after Angela had died. Vic squeezed and patted his shoulder, and the group descended towards a small clearing at the edge of the lake and closer to the waterfall. After they set up camp and Lloyd had a nice campfire going, Matt spoke up. He'd been quiet as he normally was, but it was clear that his usually tightly strung nerves had relaxed completely when he laid eyes on the pristine mountain mere. "So tell us exactly, how did you find this place, Lloyd? And why is it off the normal trails? The route was rough, but no worse than any other challenging trail. Seems like it'd be a great tourist draw." Lloyd nodded. "True. I think it just goes the wrong direction. The park services like to keep things orderly. Besides, I don't think anybody looked. Most of the park is rarely viewed or explored. Just the trails. It's truly wilderness. Oh, that reminds me. I need to check us in as arrived at our planned site." With that, he pulled out his radio and attempted to contact the station or any of the rangers who might be closer. At first he got nothing but static. Eventually, however, a voice crackled over the unit and pronounced their arrival. It sounded like the other party acknowledged, but the sound faded entirely to static, and then nothing. Lloyd switched out the battery and twiddled the antenna and some of the buttons controls, but could not get nothing more than brief bursts of light static. He tried each channel in turn, but the device was unresponsive. He eventually shrugged it off. They know we're here. They don't know where here is, though. I hated to share that bit of information. Now, where are we? How I stumbled onto paradise. Early last fall, we had a camper go missing. You know how it goes. It's always an experienced outdoorsman. usually because no one else would be in parts of the park where people tend to go disappear. Anyway, he was with the group, and they weren't actually over this way but on the main trail where we started, a pretty easy hiking trail. Mr. Meyer brought up the rear of their hiking line since he was the most experienced. He glanced at Daniel and Victor to forestall any smart-ass interruptions. Matt just stared, hypnotized by the fire and the tale. When they arrived at their next rest stop, Mr. Meyer, Alfred, did not appear. Several of them backtracked all the way to the last stop and saw no sign of him. The next hiker up the line claimed he hadn't heard anything or noticed exactly when Albert had disappeared. He was the least experienced outdoorsman and had been focused on planting one foot in front of the other, so he may have missed any unspoken stress by Albert. They contacted the station and were sent out folks to search. Then we sent out trackers with hounds as we organised a larger scale search. The dogs, they just wouldn't track. His eyes grew a little distant with thoughts of his own canine, but he gamely took up the thread. The hounds, they would just circle a while, then whine and lay on the ground. I've heard of things like that, but had never witnessed it. Not all dogs will track, but these were hounds, bred and trained to do it. Weird. So we formed lines and walked back and forth along the trail, and pretty far to either side. There was no sign of the man, no lost gear, no scuffs in the dirt or leaves, no animal tracks, no blood splatter or drag marks, like something had flown down and plucked him from the ground, without even giving him a chance to even call out to his friends. I sent my team to search unexpected areas where he may have wandered, but to no avail. I ventured the farthest, and I came upon that river that drops off into the lake and followed it to the cliff. I looked to see if he had somehow fallen in and washed downstream. If he had, I'd have found signs of it. Then I reached that fall, looked out over. Well, this. Lloyd gestured all around them as the last purple light faded in the west and the stars above lit the world with their own cold light. A gentle breeze hitting the ice fan through the trees near the encampment, and the men gazed around at the pellucid lake and looming forest. It was as though they were among the first humans and no other world impinged upon this valley. Vic was the first to break the spell. So, how much of the area have you explored? Lloyd shook off his reverie. Oh, well, none of it really. I was at the far end of the search area, actually well beyond it. There are rapids above the waterfall, and the water was shallow enough that any corpse would have snagged on the rocks. I felt bad for his family and friends. His disappearance was my first failure as a manager, yet no one seems to have held it against me. I just wish we could have found some sign of the man. I don't like unsolvable puzzles. At that, their conversation descended into a brief argument over whether there was any such thing as an unsolvable puzzle. They moved on to whether there were supernatural elements involved. It was a fun talk, the way they had chatted as boys about everything from the most inconsequential subjects to how to solve some of the world's massive problems. They ate supper, and once it was prepared, stored the rest of the food in a bear bag near the campsite. They were tired but spoke on into the night. The magic of the lake infused them with a spiritual, if not physical, energy. Matt looked to his side at the surface of the water that mirrored the stars and the shadowy mountain spur. I'll be glad when Annabelle and I can bring little Charlotte to see this. Maybe we should start bringing the families. We've had plenty of adventure trips and we're not... His comments were interrupted by an ear-splitting howl from the woods just above, on the slopes that led up to the mountain towards the top of the fall. All of the men sat up in shock and Victor groped around his pistol. Lloyd still wore his but simply looked around in momentary shock and then started to relax almost immediately. Just a lone wolf, he thought calmly. The night's peace was shattered by answering howls and wails in the various directions and distances around them. The forest came alive with the sounds that emanated from every direction, but the lake, yet echoes from the body of water, made it seem as though even in its depths had awakened to shatter the nerves of mere mortals who would dare to disturb the marvel of nature that was this valley. The cacophony of howls and cries continued to gain in numbers and volume until even had the party of men attempted to speak, they would not have been heard. Their fire cast flickering shadows among the boles and limbs of the surrounding forest. Among the shadows fitted deeper shades and brief flashes of dark fur and bare human flesh. Figures darted among the trees and yipped and yelped to add a counter to the deeper howls and cries. The dance within the trees continued what seemed like hours, but was no more than a few minutes, and then it all abruptly ceased. The forest went dead silent. Each of the men around the fire stood facing out into the darkness, each panting heavily in fear from the jangled nerves. A low, cold, raspy voice called from the darkness.
"We have heard your piteous cries, your meaningless cub howls. We have heard your foolish man chatter of being a pack. Fenrir's pack holds this territory. Your pack has challenged us, and we accept."
At that, the noise once again rose to a crescendo, and this time it faded into the night rather than ending abruptly. The dark figures no longer menaced the men from within the night's shadowed woods, and the sounds covered any noises that Fenrir's pack made as they returned whence they'd come. The men stood, nervously glancing into the darkness and flinching at every noise, even from the crackling of their own campfire. They eventually began to look inward towards one another. Victor was first to speak. "What the actual fuck was that?" Matt picked up some wood and tossed it onto the fire. Lloyd stopped Daniel from doing the same. "We need to preserve the wood. None of us will want to go looking for more in the dark. Obviously there were humans involved, but those animal noises, they sounded real. It wasn't just people out there pretending to be wolves. It may be somebody playing games. Maybe some group found this place before and is trying to get us to leave. That name, Fenrir's pack, it sounded like a cult maybe. We get those or rumours of them." Daniel was the first to break the tension. "Like old man Cranston trying to get us to leave the haunted woods so he could claim the silver mine? Huh? Raggy?" He did this best Scooby-Doo voice for the last. Everyone else stared at him. They would normally laugh at his spot-on Scooby impression, but they just weren't ready, and there was still too much tension, too much fear. Victor growled, "Lloyd, what kind of freaks are out here? Is it just hippie dopers, hillbillies, somebody left over from Donner Party? What the fuck, bro?" Lloyd, normally nonplussed, stuttered a little. Like I said, I don't know. There was no sign of people when I was here last time. I wasn't supposed to go as far as I did on my own, so it's not like I could ask around. Even when I gave the location of our camp, I kept it among the supervisors." Matt, calm as usual, broke in. "Well, Lloyd, perhaps you should try the radio again. If that doesn't work, we'll have to stay up until the morning and work out watches. Fire didn't seem to disturb the animals, if there were any." Lloyd tried the radio until the primary battery was down to 25%. The rest of the men gathered close to the fire. Eventually, when the radio hissed its last, Victor rasped out, "So Lloyd, no stories about anything like this? No legends or campfire tales?" Lloyd sighed heavily. "There are tons of stories about spooky crap. I wouldn't even know where to start. There are stories of voices coming from the dark, usually mimicking a lost member of the party or a human in distress. Those are used to lure people out into the woods. There are stories of animals snatching people, stories of people just disappearing, UFOs, squatches, dogmen, interdimensional portals, you name it. National parks are the heart of where such tales reside." Victor nodded. "So, any idea who or what just came out of the dark to jack us?" Lloyd stared into the fire. He had a small night vision viewer in his pack, and with the fire, none of them would be able to peer successfully into the nightscape unaided. He'd need to dig out the little device, and Vic had a similar one in his gear. This was weird, almost like it was rehearsed. Maybe even some kind of ritual insult/challenge thing. I think that there were plenty of warm bodies running through the woods. Odd that only one spoke and the rest seemed to obey some other cues. I just don't know, guys. This is not one I've heard of. Voices in the dark that issue challenges? One thing though, he called it Fenrir's Pack. Fenrir was the original big bad wolf of Norse mythology. He bit off the hand of the god Tyr and is fated to kill Odin in Ragnarok. Nasty character. Maybe it's some kind of weird cult, though the Fenrir wolf was typically considered a monster, a giant spawn rather than a god. That's about the end of my Norse mythology 101. Weird for this part of the world. I'd expect a native legend. They continued to discuss the events but came up with no solid answers. Then they spoke on how they should spend the rest of the night. They settled on a 2-man watch for 2-hour intervals. Lloyd and Daniel first, then Matt and Victor. It seemed unlikely that any of them would get much sleep, but they trusted one another, and so, if it was possible, they would rest. Each slept with a pistol and a flashlight to hand, and Lloyd and Victor each had their little night scopes. Lloyd sat pondering as he leaned against a log and faced into the night. Daniel had settled against a stump on the other side of the camp so that each man could cover from the lake's edge to the area directly across the campfire from the water. They remained silent and listened. It had been a tiring day, though it was tough to stay awake. About 90 minutes in, Daniel felt himself nod off a few times but did not feel it when he slipped into a doze. His natural imagination, the many movies and images that he'd seen in his youth, and the events of the day and evening combined as fuel for nightmare images. He and the others stood around the campfire. Once again, the howls and the shifting shadows danced through the trees, and faces leered at him within the few places that a light of the fire reached. His heart pounded and his ears roared. A large figure sprang into the small camp space and grabbed Vic. Vic fought, but the thing dragged him into the night like a bear snatching a chihuahua. Lloyd was next, and 2 figures grabbed at him and tore him in half. Matt looked on in horror, and then a larger-than-ever figure loomed behind him, leaned down and bit off his head. The figures were variations on movie and popular fantasy werewolves from the past few decades. At last, as he found himself alone, the light of the fire dwindled and the shadows merged, and within them teeth gnashed. One figure pushed its face up close to his own. He could smell the fetid, carnivore breath hot on his face. The eyes burned and glared malevolence, and a low, throaty growl escaped its fang-filled maw. Daniel's eyes snapped open and he was physically startled. He looked around towards Lloyd, hoping that his friend had not caught him sleeping on sentry duty. It seemed like a big deal to him and Vic and the military brothers. No worries, he thought. Lloyd sat there, head on swivel, alert enough for all 4 of them. Daniel turned his eyes back towards his own sector. The fire still showed little. Clouds had moved in to obscure the stars and any light the otherwise bright moon may have added. Then he caught the glints, and as he stared, the eye shine of some large animal just within the trees to his right, towards the lake. The creature made no noise at first, but as he strained to listen, Daniel was sure he heard panting. The fire shifted, and in the momentary additional light, he saw steam rise from just below the eyes. Whatever it was, it breathed and was large. Maybe a bear. He leaned forward and started to turn to alert Lloyd when he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his left forearm. He heard a snap of bone and felt his entire body shift away from his seat and towards the trees. He screamed in agony and fear. Lloyd, who had been a little lost in contemplation, first knew that they had company when his friend let out a horrendous cry. He was on his feet in an instant, the muzzle of his pistol and the beam of his flashlight shining towards the area where Daniel scrabbled at the ground and a nearby tree trunk to arrest his momentum into the darkness. His legs kicked frantically. Vic and Matt stirred and rose in their sleeping bags. Vic clutched for his pistol and Matt for his flashlight. Lloyd couldn't fire at whatever dragged his friend. He'd be more likely to hit Daniel, whose feet were now the only visible part of him. And so he fired above, into the tree limbs that crossed so thoroughly and prevented light from getting too far into the trees. He fired only one round, since he wanted to be prepared to fight. Apparently, that was enough. Daniel cried out once more, but the soles of his boots were still visible. Lloyd and Vic moved forward to cover Daniel, and Matt seized the man's lower legs and, against normal medical procedures, pulled his friend back into the light of the fire. The two warriors shone their lights and covered firing sectors, but they only caught fleeting glimpses of their erstwhile attackers. Disturbing glimpses of dark fur and flashes of flesh, of faces both beastly and human, and somewhere in between, that quickly and quietly disappeared into the gloom. Both men were tempted to shoot, but both disciplined enough that they didn't waste the limited ammunition. Meanwhile, Matt had broken open the primary first aid kit and was quickly applying a tourniquet to Daniel's arm wound, just above the elbow. He had scratches and claw marks on his face and other arm, and his shirt was torn in several places. His left eye was nearly swollen shut, and a large bruise promised to ruin his features for days. Lloyd and Victor moved in closer, but kept the surrounding darkness covered. Vic gestured to Lloyd, who nodded in return. Vic then retrieved his little night scope and used it to inspect the area from which the attack emanated. After a moment, he glanced at Lloyd. Nada. He then scanned the rest of the surrounding trees, but eventually shook his head. No signs. It's like the shadows jumped up and seized him. Lloyd looked down at Matt, who was busily working on Daniel's arm. Daniel had thankfully lost consciousness, though once he applied the tourniquet, Matt had dosed him with morphine, so he could just be doped. He wasn't likely to wake up until Matt was able to take care of the initial painful steps to save his friend's life and limb, cleaning and closing the major wounds. Lloyd and Matt knew that they'd be useless for anything else, so Lloyd dug out his own night scope and he and Victor resumed watching sectors. They would do so all night, while Matt worked feverishly with the limited equipment to save their brother. By the time the first rays of sun dimly emerged, as if in fear of what might still lurk in the darkness, the skies were filled with clouds, and there was still little light. Matt sat back, clearly exhausted, while Daniel slept on like a log. His face was pale and contorted in pain, but he was otherwise calm and still. Matt let out a long, slow breath. I've done what I can. I just don't have the equipment for the final work. He should live provided we can get him back and prevent the shock from worsening. We may even be able to save that arm, though both the radius and the ulna are broken badly, splintered. No more pitching. The rest I'm sure hurts, but it's superficial. We have a few more doses of morphine. He trailed off. His fatigue was obvious. Lloyd patted his brother's shoulder. You did everything you could, Matt. Only Dano would be lucky enough to have a top-of-the-line neurosurgeon along when he got his arm chewed. I didn't get to see the wound close up. Any idea what bit him? Matt peered up at him, still a little slow in thinking after hours of fear, stress, and total concentration. Lloyd, that's your area of expertise. I have no idea. Lloyd nodded. Maybe just point out where the tooth marks were. You bandaged him thoroughly, so I can't see. Matt nodded in turn. Oh, sure. He pointed to where the primary wounds had been. 2 went in here and 2 here, just opposite. Those were closer together, like bottom teeth of a carnivore. There were plenty of smaller teeth marks. Victor leaned in a little to watch, then looked up at Lloyd. Bear, you think? Kinda big for a wolf. Lloyd agreed. Yes, likely a bear. Not enough claw marks for a mountain lion. Way too big for a coyote. Maybe a wolf, but it'd have to be gargantuan. Weird though, what bear would travel with, or even near a pack of wolves, and creepy humans? Lloyd briefly tried the radio again to no avail, unless the static could come to their aid. It's like something's here won't let the radio waves transmit. Maybe I should climb up to the top of the falls and try there. Victor shook his head. You'd have to go alone. Matt needs to crash for a while and Daniel is helpless. I'd have to stay here on guard alone. Not a good idea to split our forces. Maybe climb a tree? Lloyd thought for a moment, shrugged and looked around for a likely tree that he could climb without too much strain. You're right. Top, Vic. Watch my 6 while I go dance the lumberjack crawl. You had a long night. You shouldn't be dancing with lumberjacks or whatever you do hidden away here in the mountains." Vic grinned wickedly at his friend to break some of the tension. Lloyd just huffed out a little laugh and began his ascent. Matt was wrapped snugly in his bag beside Daniel and already snored lightly. Lloyd climbed as high as he could and tried the radio again. He was able to get some static, and then on the emergency notification channel he could make out something about unexpected snowfall, but not the areas that would be impacted or to what degree. All storms were dangerous, but he particularly disliked spring storms. They were large but sneaky in his mind, treacherous things of watery ice and thunder snow. He stayed up until his primary battery had dropped to well under half-life. He may have made it out. He'd asked for immediate rescue, but potentially answering voices faded quickly to white noise. He climbed back down and briefed Vic. They ate some rations and then Lloyd insisted that Vic try to get some more sleep. He agreed on 2 hours and then he'd wake up and relieve Lloyd. After that, they'd wake Matt and figure out what to do if no signs of help arrived. Lloyd perched on the stump against which Dano had leaned the night previous. He studied the ground and the drag marks and blood stains on the ground. He stood and followed the marks into the woodline for several feet. Then he saw, in an area where the straw had been disturbed and the dirt beneath revealed, an enormous wolf paw print. The thing would have weighed in at over 200 pounds. At the edge of that was the mark of what may have been the ball of a human foot, but just beyond the toes were small indentations, like claw marks in the loam. A clawed human foot. Lloyd checked on his friends and then walked the short way down to the lake. In the muddy sand, there were a few prints similar to what he'd already seen, but of slightly smaller size in the case of a wolf print. These creatures had been down to the water's edge without anyone in Lloyd's pack of brothers seeing them. He quietly stalked back to his perch and thought that he would discuss it with the others when they had all rested. He'd love to hear Vic's opinion on the tracks. About that time, he felt the wind freshen up and first flakes of icy spring snow pattered against his face. Great, he thought. My host year is turning into a disaster. I sure hope Daniel plans something better for us next year. When he recovers. He went out about setting up shelters with the gloomy thought that a storm would keep them in place, and time was a factor for Daniel, and maybe for them all. Lloyd's 2 hours went by quickly, and Vic roused, stretched, and looked away, too tired, but game for his turn. He looked up sourly at now heavily falling snow. Take 4, Lloyd-o. You have yet to take a rest. I'm going to step into the tree line to do what the bears do out here in the woods, but get settled. I won't be a moment, and I'll stay close. Lloyd nodded. Suddenly, all was asleep on his feet, yet he felt the need to get Daniel and Matt under their shelter. He woke Matt, and they prepared the area inside the small tent so that Daniel could stay close to Matt and keep him warm. And when they once again emerged, it was to find Daniel's sleeping bag open and abandoned. Vic walked up, having finished his business, and saw the looks on the other men's faces. "What's up?" Lloyd and Matt simply looked at Daniel's empty sleeping mat and back at Vic, and Lloyd spoke first. "Did you see him, Vic? We were getting the tent ready. We weren't in there for more than a couple of minutes." They all looked around, bewildered and scared for their friend. "Matt, he could have gotten up and walked." Matt shook his head. "No way. I didn't want to say, but he was in a really bad shape this morning. Feverish and in deep shock. He couldn't even have rolled over on his own, much less walked out of the camp." Lloyd inspected the area and found fresh prints in the snow, a mix of human and lupine. They left in the same direction in which Daniel had been dragged the night previous. The men gathered together, each with pistol in hand, and followed the tracks into the trees. The trail led upward into a small boulder field. There the snow cover was less complete, and the trail became less distinct among the large rocks and hard ground. The large shapes that extruded from the ground loomed above and created deeper shadows inside an already gloomy day. As they rounded a particularly large stone, Lloyd, in the lead, stopped abruptly, and Matt ran into him. Vic halted and quickly looked behind to cover the rear approach. Lloyd would have sworn that he caught a glimpse of a familiar jacket for just a moment just up ahead. "Did you see that?" he queried his companions. Matt shook his head and Vic asked, "What?" Lloyd indicated the trail ahead and to the left with his hand. "There was a flash of blue and yellow, like Dano's jacket, just up the trail. No way he could be walking, especially uphill like that and fast." He looked at Matt for confirmation and got a nod. "No way. He shouldn't be on his feet, much less climbing. I'm sorry, I didn't see anything. I'm just not used to tracking." Lloyd gave his friend a tight smile. "No worries, Matt. You have every reason to be out of it. We're all pretty beat. I just don't want to leave old Dano." "None of us does," he added quickly. They trekked forward as the large wet flakes continued to fall, and there were more large wolf tracks in the snow ahead. Then they found Daniel's boots, abandoned on the small outcropping of rock, neatly laced, tied, and standing side by side. His jacket was neatly folded beside them, torn, bloodied, and worse for wear, but laid out as if on display at the store. The tracks around the outcropping had been deliberately distorted and wiped with something. One set of large wolf prints led straight uphill. Other less distinct trails led in various directions. They determined to follow the clear tracks even though it was the toughest trail. They climbed as quickly as possible. Dano had no jacket or boots, and with his wounds. After another hour, the remaining tracks abruptly ended. They looked as though someone had brushed them from the trail, but it wasn't entirely clear since the snow had quickly filled in the details. They stopped to rest in a small clearing in the trees. Lloyd and Victor looked over each other's shoulders and kept watch while Matt just sat up against a tree and closed his eyes for a moment. Victor spoke the unspeakable first. "If we've lost the trail, we'll have to go back to camp, at least to retrieve the rest of the gear. Hey, Lloyd, maybe try the radio again? We're higher than we were, even with the storm." "Good thinking, Tup," Lloyd said as he fished out the radio and tried to send another emergency broadcast. He was rewarded with some static and an unclear voice. He spoke into the mic again and told them the location and to look for the locator beacon signals. The response was static-filled and unclear. Further attempts produced nothing but an impressive variety of electronic hisses. Lloyd looked at Vic helplessly and shrugged. "Nothing for it. They heard or they didn't. And we're going to have to get back to camp and gather the gear, maybe nap and eat and then try again. Maybe the snow will abate. It wasn't even in the forecast." Vic and Matt agreed, and the three men made their weary ways to their feet and started a long, slow slog back down to camp. They decided to continue down the lake and then follow it around to their campsite. They might as well learn the area when the storm ended and the real search began. They would need as much knowledge of the terrain as possible to find their poor, lost brother. Victor did his best to remain vigilant and guard the rear of the tiny procession as they made their way to the edge of the lake. It was a relief to find the shoreline and the more clear line of sight within the slightly less sparse tree cover. He glanced around constantly and over his shoulder frequently. What was that movement? A set of shadows fitted among the trees to the rear and on a high ground away from the lake. The snowfall was arrested by the close limbs of conifers, but enough still fell to obscure the view. There! Definitely something, and maybe someone out there stalking parallel to their trail. 2- and 4-legged shapes flashed in and out of view, interchangeably. He unconsciously slowed his pace, but quite deliberately took out his pistol. His mode switched from woodsman to warrior. He was about to call out to the others that they had company, when he heard a rush of paws and feet come from behind him, from towards the lake. As he turned to face the immediate threat, something large bowled him over and knocked the wind from him. Before he could draw a breath to scream, jaws clamped around his throat and wrists were seized in fantastically strong grips. The weight of the creature on top of him, combined with the pressure on his windpipe, eventually completed their work as his consciousness fled. Matt slogged on behind Lloyd. He knew that he was only along because he'd be helpless on his own. He could shoot, but he wouldn't know what to shoot until it was upon him. He was so tired. His efforts to save Daniel, now all for naught, had exhausted him. He hadn't said so to the others, but he was sure that Daniel could not have survived a rough removal from camp and from his outer clothing. He was in emotional shock from the loss of his brother and over how to break the news to his remaining friends. They'd be conducting a recovery mission rather than a search and rescue. As much as they loved Daniel, The new mission just wouldn't have the same priority level. He was startled when he all but ran into Lloyd again, but this time the big man had turned to face him. "You alright, Matt?" I turned to look and he'd fallen behind. "I think we're all exhausted." All Matt could manage in reply was a weak nod. Lloyd looked up and over Matt's shoulder to find Vic. He was nowhere in sight. "Matt, have you seen Vic? Did he fall behind?" No way he could have lost the trail, with the lake on the left. Maybe he had to take another personal break? Matt looked up and around, clearly confused. To be honest, I haven't paid as much attention as I should have. Vic is so competent. It just didn't occur to me." Lloyd made a command decision, cupped his hands and called out, "Vic! Victor! Show yourself, Top! Top! Top!" The two men were greeted with silence. Lloyd took his friend by the arm briefly and said, "Come on, we have to backtrack. He may be in a fix." They backtracked until they found the signs where Vic's large frame had impacted the snow and where he had briefly struggled to regain his freedom. He'd obviously failed to win it. There were brush tracks all around it, but it was unclear which direction his captors had taken him. "Oh, gods!" Lloyd hissed quietly as he ran his hands under the hood of his jacket and through his hair. He again took Matt by the arm. "Come on, it's not much farther. Let's get the gear and a meal. We can't do anything if we let ourselves starve and freeze." The men hurried as best as they could, now having to slog a little as the depth of the snow increased. At last they came upon their former campsite. All of their gear and food they'd left behind was gone. The fire was long out, but set over the cold coals with a dark green jacket, folded neatly, and on top of that, a pair of US military-issued cold-weather boots. Matt stood in shock, but Lloyd forged ahead and began to look for tracks, and there were signs and tracks everywhere. Paw prints and the balls of human feet completely intermingled, as though they were creatures of both species. Lloyd's mind raced, but went nowhere that made sense. Then he was startled by a cry from Matt. His thin, wiry frame faced the lake. The exquisite scene was now marred by the sight of blue-grey flesh, and the head of a short-cropped hair asset above broad shoulders rested on the bank. Both men ran forward and pulled Vic's body from the freezing water. He was in nothing but underclothes, clearly not breathing, and maybe hadn't been for some time. Matt began giving him rescue breaths, and Lloyd started with the chest compressions. They worked until Matt needed a break, and they switched. Once Lloyd was equally exhausted, Matt checked for their brother's non-existent pulse. He studied Vic's body briefly, then closed his eyes and hung his head in grief. Lloyd just sat there, gasping. He fell back onto his backside and spread his gloved hands behind him, sprawled in abject defeat. Vic, the strongest man he'd ever known, laid out like a fish on the banks of what should have been a heavenly body of water. Matt, being Matt, had to keep his mind filled. He shut down his emotional reaction and fled to pure logic. He carefully and closely examined Vic. No, the strange corpse in front of him. He had to remain objective and impersonal. He could scream and bawl later, and knew that he would. He saw clear bite wounds on the throat. They had barely penetrated and had relied rather on crushing force. And there was more bruising on the wrists and shins. He noted that despite their rigorous attempts to revive the man, no water had emerged from his mouth or nose. Not definite, but the body had likely been dead when placed into the water. "Lloyd." His friend remained silent and staring. "Lloyd!" The big park ranger's eyes rose to meet Matt's, but he remained in his defeated posture. "Vic didn't drown. He was likely suffocated and then put in the water. That means someone with hands did it or took part in it. And there may be wolves out there too, but human hands did this and clearly stacked the clothing. So what do you think is happening with this Fenrir's pack? Who are they really?" Lloyd finally gathered himself and sat up. "I think the question is, what are they, Doc?" He sighed and collected his thoughts. "Based on the tracks and the rare glimpses we've had of these things, maybe they're some kind of freakish blend of human and wolf." Matt looked incredulous. "Like some fantasy werewolf creature? You let your imagination run wild. You and Daniel with your horror crap." Lloyd was a little startled at the vehemence of which his friend spoke. He knew Matt clung to science and logic when under stress and that his emotions would burst out later. I'm just saying that there are things in the wilderness that might surprise you. I haven't seen anything like this, but there are stories. They go all the way back into native legends. He trailed off in thought. Matt would not let it go. Are you telling me some kind of native lore did that? He pointed to the corpse, which looked even more grey and devoid of any spark of life. The fluids were freezing within it. Some kind of skin changer or walker or whatever they call it? Some werewolf? Ridiculous! He stomped away a short distance and stared out over the preternaturally still waters. Lloyd climbed to his feet. The snow had slackened, but it was getting late in the day and colder. The sky to the north showed just a bit of clearing, and so the sneaky storm would soon pass. He began walking around the camp to see if their attackers had left anything useful. They hadn't. Even the bear bag was gone. He and Matt would have to make a run for it. They could make the water crossing before dark. From there, it would be tough in the dark, but they'd have to keep walking to keep from freezing. And it was obvious that fire was no deterrent to whatever stalked them. He could only hope that bullets might work. Come on, Matt. Nothing left to do but survive. I hate to leave Vic out like this, but we have to get going. You have a wife and baby girl waiting for you, and we'll both have to be there for Vic's kiddos. They are, after all, our nieces and nephews. Matt kept staring for a moment. The lake had hypnotizing effects on him. We'll have to look out for Daniel too. He could not have survived the further trauma. Let's go. They began their journey in silence, and when possible walked side by side. They crossed the saddle before dark, but made it only to the edge of the fast-flowing stream. The sky cleared, but temperatures dropped rapidly. They found a spot with rocks on one side to act as a barricade, and a fallen tree to cover one flank. The stream covered the other. They gathered firewood and made another camp. After all, fire might not deter the children of the night, but nothing would want to walk through it to get at them. They'd already consumed their emergency energy bars, and so it was hungry camp, but it was as warm as possible. Both men soon nodded in exhaustion and fell into a deep slumber. Each held on to a gloomy thought as his consciousness faded. They knew that if they didn't make it back tomorrow, that they never would. The men were brought instantly awake by the cacophony of howls and wails and yips and snarls. Lloyd quickly threw a few sticks on the dwindling fire. Each man stood and pointed the muzzle of his pistol into the darkness at the edge of the fire. The noise abruptly ceased, and the cold, coarse voice once again addressed them.
Your pack has been cut in half. Your challenge has failed. We have stalked the Western lands for over 1,000 years. We have fed your legends and filled your nightmares. Meet the newest member of Fenrir's pack.
With that, a gigantic wolf sprang into the space beyond the fire. It was partially clothed in Daniel's shirt and what was left of his underpants. A bloodied bandage clung to its right forepaw. It snarled and slavered, but hesitated to cross the fire. Lloyd and Matt just gasped and gaped at the living impossibility before them. Their friend, their brother, transformed into a beast. Its reddish fur even matched Dano's ginger locks. Lloyd's nerves unlocked first, and he fired at the enormous beast. It let out a pained yelp and quickly swelled and leapt back into the covering of darkness. Matt fired a few rounds in sympathy, but they were randomly into the trees out front. Low laughter erupted from the several directions, and the cold voice spoke again, and this time from above and behind them.
So, you do not welcome your erstwhile brother. You attack him and drive him into the brush. All the time we have stalked you, you never fought until we put one of your own in front of you. Pathetic creatures. You are not worth hunting and may not be worth eating. Yet, we will find out. Perhaps your weakness has led to tender meat.
The laughter from all around started again. Low, chuckling growls joined it. Eventually, it faded, and the long silence was all that was left to break the reverie of the two men. Lloyd was first to lower his firearm. His arm had begun to shake with the effort of holding it out before him. Even with the two-handed grip, Matt holstered his and abruptly sat cross-legged and stared into the trees and shadows. Lloyd brushed off the seat of his pants and then sat beside his last pack mate. They sat in silence until the first hints of dawn, and then prepared to make their run. They stretched and drank what was left of their water bottles. They'd have to risk filling up at the rill. Boyd carefully put out the fire and covered it in snow as the added precaution. He turned away to urinate, surreptitiously examine the area for any signs left by Fenrir's pack. That name, the concept of it, a wolf cult that worshipped a demon wolf. Matt walked around the end of the fallen log that had protected their flank in the night. He had to leave a nice steamy present for their friends. Hopefully, one would get a snoutful. Boyd was ready to go. He just wanted to make it to the trailhead. It occurred to him to try the radio again. The first battery was dead, and so he fished out the backup. He tried the emergency channel, but it was mostly static and dead air. However, when he tried the primary channel, he got an immediate response.
"Hey, Captain, we've been worried about you. That storm came up out of nowhere. What's your status?"
Boyd flushed with relief. He gave a quick update on their location and condition and informed the ranger that there would be a need for a recovery operation on 2 of the party. He had been so relieved that he had broken radio discipline and had spoken without a break for far too long. The response came back broken and full of static.
"Cap, we hear you. Ace and hell."
It trailed off in full static. It didn't matter. They were close, and if they went just a little farther, they'd be able to meet with his team members. Lloyd called out, "Matt, get a move on. I've made contact. We have people looking for us. Only a matter of time." He injected a very slight humour into the call to his friend as a result of suddenly relaxed tension. His relief was short-lived, however, as Matt failed to respond. He walked quickly around to the end of the fallen trees and saw that the only thing left from Matt was a pile of excrement and a spray of blood on the fresh fallen snow. "Matt!" he screamed, a primal scream full of fear and tragic certainty that the 4-pack was now a single life. He quickly started across the little stream, this time without bothering to connect the safety line that was still in place. He had made it once and almost made it again. He suddenly found himself floating rapidly downstream in a shallow but strong current. He must have slipped on the fresh ice and snow on the rocks. He managed to turn himself and get his feet to set into the stream bed. From there, he was able to stand and scramble up the far bank. He desperately wanted to just collapse and go to sleep, but that way led only to death. He clambered to his feet and started to vector back towards the trail. He was shortly able to see the slight clearing of trees and a broken-off sapling that had marked the trail when there was something wrong with the sapling. It was dead, but not rotten, but now it had grown a bulbous shape at the top. No, 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 no! His mind insanely gibbered as the sight registered and the form resolved itself into the shape of Matt's brilliant head. The mouth gaped and the eyes stared emptily at the boles and limbs of the forest of fear.
"Ha!"
A bark of laughter sounded from just behind him. He quickly spun on his heel, drew his pistol and fired. A surprised grunt greeted him, followed instantly by crushing, agonizing grip on his gun hand. An enormous black wolf held his hand in its terrible maw, and a human wrapped in wolf skins with a wolf mask over its face lay crumpled on the ground before him. The man-thing was no longer laughing, and it clutched at its belly from which gore spilled and mewed helplessly. At the sound, Lloyd heard a terrific scream. At first he did not comprehend the source, but it was close. At last he realized it emanated from his own throat. The wolf had torn off his hand, and anguish now only registered. He gripped the stump as hard as he could, and raised the limb as he had been trained. Another voice rang out through the woods, followed instantly by yips and growls and snarls. Numerous figures crowded in from snowy landscape. "Stop! Storslem Ulf has fallen. The mankin has beaten our Alpha, fairly and with the weapons of his kind." Lloyd kept several items about his person, rather than in his now lost pack, one of which was a small tourniquet like Matt had used on Daniel. He pulled it loose and quickly placed it on his wrist. He tightened it until he almost passed out from the pain and pressure. As his greyed vision cleared, he saw that the owner of the new voice, an equally cold one, was a woman. Her visage was hidden by a wolf-hide mask, and had been that of a man on the ground at his feet, who clutched at his wound and shuddered out his life as Lloyd gazed on in terrified shock. The woman, whose eyes and chin were visible, along with strands of long darkish hair, spoke once more. "You lost the struggle for territory, but have killed the alpha of our pack. Now we must decide what to do with you. Let you live, and you will talk to your kind, and soon mankin will swarm all over our valley. We cannot take you with us. Not all members of our pack had enough to eat this morning. Your friend was skinny." She peered at his wound for a moment. "Like that of Tyr, whom our father wounded and at whom he respected." At that moment, Lloyd's radio squawked, "Hey Cap, we're at the trailhead. Are you near? The locators aren't working." Lloyd began to laugh hysterically, and then his eyes rolled up in his head and he hit the ground. His team found him not far along the trail to his special place. They got him back to the station and from there to hospital. After surgery to save first his life and then his lower arm, he was eventually sent to recovery. He realized where he was but couldn't remember anything else. He felt himself being wheeled somewhere and then lifted and placed on a soft, warm bed. When next he woke, a man stood near him. He wore a uniform like a nurse or physician's assistant. He had a beard and longish hair. Something about him was a bit vulpine. He smiled in a friendly way. "So, how are you, my friend? It's good to see you awake. We've been waiting a while for you to regain your senses." Lloyd's wrists ached horribly, but he felt detached from the pain. Opioids. He had to get them to stop that. He feared addiction, as any man who avoided it after tragedy would. He looked at his friend a little blearily. "I know I'm in hospital, but why? Where are my friends?" He was deeply confused and wasn't sure he understood the answers anyway. The slightly sinister hospital worker gave him a toothy grin. "So, you don't know what has happened to my friend?" Lloyd, despite his mind being under heavy drug influence and still suffering from exposure, managed to be a little annoyed. He didn't like this guy, and he certainly didn't like that the fellow kept calling him my friend. Even in his state, he could recognize the detest a poseur. He closed his eyes and drifted back into a healing sleep. When he again awakened, his head was more clear, and he visited a real doctor. Not Matt, though. Where was Matt? The doctor told him that he'd been camping with his friends and that they were missing. It looked as though a large animal had bitten off his hand. Yes, he would eventually get a prosthesis. No, the doctor didn't know if he'd be able to return to full duty. The doctor asked if he'd be up to visitors, and Lloyd readily agreed. He wanted answers. The doctor informed him that his boss and some others would be in later that day, or in the morning. As the doctor left, another figure emerged from the bathroom, the hairy medical worker. "So, my friend, more memories today?" Lloyd stared at the unpleasant creature for a moment, but decided he might as well say it. He would get around soon enough. "Nope, not even flashes. The last thing I remember is hanging out with my brothers before we all went to bed. We were going camping. I don't recall where, but it was special." And then he whispered, "The world was young, the mountains green, no stain yet on, the moon was seen." He trailed off and his eyes clouded, then shifted towards the window. The vulpine man smiled in a manner that would have frightened Lloyd if he'd seen it. The man slipped away quietly from the room. Lloyd drifted off to sleep and dreamed of a place, a magical, wild place, with a lake and his friends, his brothers, sitting around a fire beside it, each looking at him with a wide smile, waiting for him to join them. He waved to them enthusiastically and started to run to join them. And then figures arose from the shadows beneath the trees that surrounded the trio. Darkness immediately encroached, and wicked eyes shone, and sharp teeth and claws glinted as the figures resolved into werewolves. Lloyd screamed out loud as he awakened, drenched in sweat. He looked around with the lingering fear from his nightmare. His room was crowded. He saw his boss standing near the bed, looking worriedly down at him. As his heartbeat slowed and he regained full consciousness, Thom placed a hand on his good shoulder. "You okay, Lloyd? You had us worried for a minute. Looked like a fever dream or hallucination." He smiled reassuringly, and Lloyd relaxed. He had known Thom for years, and the man had been his mentor. "I'll make it." He raised the stump of his right wrist. "Not sure how much use I'll be to the team, though." Thom patted his shoulder reassuringly. "You'll have a place with us as long as you need it. Not many park rangers have taken on a full grizzly and survived." Lloyd looked up confused and thought, "Grizzly? No one has told me yet. Still, just doesn't seem right." He kept the thought to himself, time for others to talk. Another man stepped up close and Thom introduced him as Mr. Newbury, an authority from higher within the organisation. "Hello, Lloyd. I just wanted to check on you and let you know that we'll be looking out for you. I'm very sorry about your friends. That storm caught us all off guard. We are still sorting out what happened. We'd certainly like to get your take." The man's emotionless smile sent a chill through Lloyd's already rattled nervous system. Newbury indicated a woman who had stood by quietly. "Miss Harris is from our HR department. She will explain your benefits and responsibilities. She is the local manager, so you are getting a first-class response." The woman nodded to him. "Hello, Lloyd. We'll have you taken care of shortly. I'm going to leave these forms here on your portable table while Mr. Newbury speaks with you. I'll be with you shortly." With that, she made her way out of the door and left only one other figure besides Thom and Newbury. A hulking young man who stood uncomfortably in the far corner of the room. He wore a nice suit and had a neatly trimmed curly beard, but his hair was long and a bit wild. He just looked on in apparent disinterest. Thom sat in a chair next to the bed. Newbury took a seat on a small love bench on the other side. Newbury leaned forward slightly. "So, Lloyd, please tell us everything you can recall from the time when your friends arrived. Be as detailed as possible." Lloyd composed himself for a moment, and then charged into the inevitable. "Dano and Matt arrived first. They were together. We knew that Vic wouldn't be far behind. I took them to my cabin and we looked over gear and got caught up on each other's lives. I had planned to take them to a lake or a valley, somewhere off the normal trails. We like to have adventures. I remember crossing the stream and Dano fell in, but the safety line saved him. We gave a group howl." He paused. "That's something we've done ever since high school. Timberwolves was our mascot. From there, I just don't remember anything until the guys picked me up at the trailhead. Maybe some sensation, being really cold, tired and hungry." He trailed off with a look on his face that hoped projected deep concentration. Newbury asked, "How about Victor? I understand that you two were particularly close. Both joined the army out of high school." Lloyd looked at him in incomprehension, so the man continued. "We found his body by the lake. The initial coroner's report says there were indications that someone had attempted CPR on him, but he had already died of exposure. He was unclothed, almost as though he had gone into the water." At this, he inquisitively raised an eyebrow. Lloyd thought hard. "Vic is gone. How?" He thought the man wasn't stupid, nor was he suicidal. It had been the best years of his life. This is the first I knew of what happened to him. I knew that the other guys, my brothers, my friends since childhood, were missing, but I thought that they'd been out looking for me. I don't know exactly what took my hand, but when I dream, it's a wolf, not a bear." He paused and sank deeper into thought for a moment, then asked quietly, "What about Dano and Matt? Any signs of them?" Thom spoke up. "Lloyd, we're looking now. Based on the little we know, we had to assume search and rescue, but I wanted to tell you myself. We're about to change to a recovery operation. Lloyd, something attacked you. Maybe killed your friends. Maybe Victor jumped into the lake to escape and ended up passing from exposure. Please, try to remember anything you can. It may help." Lloyd thought hard. "Howling. We heard howling and growling in the woods. Fire. I remember looking into flames. That's it. I'm sorry. Barely any flashes. Even the nightmares fade quickly when I wake." He trailed off and stared into the middle distance. Thom patted his shoulder again. "That's all right, Lloyd. If you remember anything, give me a call." Newbury rose and nodded. "Thank you. We appreciate your efforts. I'm sure this entire situation is very painful for you on several levels." Lloyd guessed that the "we" to which Newbury referred was some government secret alphabet outfit. Newbury had said the right words, but had delivered them in cold fashion, like a snake that pretends to take pity on his prey before he strikes and devours the poor creature. The two men left. Lloyd expected the HR manager to come in immediately, but one more figure remained in the room. The very tall, very broad young man remained in the corner. He had stepped closer. He would have loomed in the confines of the small hospital room. He gave Lloyd a genuine smile. "Sir, my name is Bjorn. I work for a private contractor. I'd like to speak with you, but strictly voluntarily. Is that acceptable?" For some reason, the young man exuded an air of simple trustworthiness. No pretensions, no agendas, just genuine interest. And so Lloyd shrugged as best he could while laying against the upper half of his bed. "I don't know what else to add. I really want to help my friends and their families." He finished and his eyes welled for a moment. Bjorn nodded. "Yes, sir, understood. My goal was to find out what happened and to work to prevent future issues. If you were set upon in the wild, it's important to find out who or what was behind it and put a stop to the threat." Something Bjorn had said triggered a flash of memory. Who or what? Bjorn remained silent and let Lloyd recover the fragments of memory. Eventually, Lloyd looked up at him uncertainly. What he recalled made no sense, and he'd been dumped in a loony bin at the state hospital if he said it. Yet the sincere young man just looked at him patiently. "I'll eventually have to say it or I actually go nuts," Lloyd thought. He sighed. "The flashes I get. The nightmare I just had. I see. There's no way you're going to believe this. It has to be my imagination." Bjorn nodded encouragingly. "No judgment, sir. I have seen things that if I told you, you'd assume I was having a mental breakdown." Lloyd swallowed. "Werewolves. I know that's what I shouted when I awoke just now, but not just in my nightmares. Some of them ran around on two legs and spoke." He stared Bjorn in the eyes. "They called themselves Fenrir's Pack." He continued gazing at Bjorn, not knowing what reaction to expect. A laugh, a logical argument, anger at having his time wasted, a query at just what the fuck Fenrir was. He got none of those. Bjorn simply nodded. "Thank you, sir. I've taken enough of your time. I wish you a speedy recovery, and I'm truly sorry for the loss of your friends." Without another word, the young man stalked gracefully towards the door and out as Miss Harris entered. Lloyd and Miss Harris were soon deep in conversation about options and how to complete forms, and she assisted him on her laptop since he wouldn't be able to type for a while. Bjorn saw Newbury waiting outside the little gift shop in the main lobby. The man obviously wanted to pump him for information and without ceremony asked, "So, did he tell you anything useful? What did he really see?" Bjorn looked down at the man from his imposing 6'6" frame. Nothing new. He was just worried about the other three. He smiled in a predatory manner and loomed forward so that Newbury sought the better part of valor. "Yes, thank you for trying. I looked forward to working with your company." The young man quietly turned and walked towards the main doors to the hospital. Wow, 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 wow. Have another one, wow. Absolutely chest-pounding, beautifully written, absolute masterpiece there by the wonderful Michael G. Lockhart. Second story on the show here. You may remember his wonderful work from the Porcine Porkopolypse. Absolutely superb story, both of those. Michael, of varying sort of genres or flavours of story, but each one in itself is an absolute masterpiece. Thank you so much, brother, for allowing me this exclusive first dibs on it. As ever, guys and girls, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. Done this one on 0 sleep, guys. We're about 2 hours in, unedited. So I hope you really do appreciate this one. Please do share it far and wide. If you have any friends that are truckers, would be really suitable, really handy, because you know truckers are always on the road, need some constant entertainment to keep their long shifts going. And of course, any warehouse workers like myself, you guys on the night shift, the graveyard shifters, big respect to you all. I hope your working week is going along splendidly. And above all, guys, as always, remember, be safe, not sorry.